Christine.
George, hey.
How are you?
I'm very good. How are you?
It's been a long time.
It's been a very long time. I don't know, maybe, six years?
Yeah, I guess so.
Wow.
I should introduce you and say that this is Christine Kenneally, who is certainly one of the most successful people to ever attend the Santa Fe Science Writing Workshop, which must have been 6 years ago, since that's when I can't believe I haven't seen you in between.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
And Christine's also the author of this new book, The First Word, The Search for the Origins of Language, which I will hold up here to the screen so people can recognize it in their bookstores.
Thank you.
So you're all set up there with your headset? And
I think so.
Yeah, it's kind of funky.
It's tricky stuff.
I think of it as garage band television. Garage band TV. So
that seems quite right,
yeah. And just to catch up, you're in Brooklyn now?
I'm in Brooklyn. Yeah,
Park Slope.
Yeah. I've been here since, I think, 2000.
Yeah, that's nice.
It is. It's a lovely... Do you get to Brooklyn ever?
Well, I lived in New York. Most of the time I lived in Cobble Hill.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Now, that would have been before it was groovy, right?
Yeah, it was actually, for New York, it was reasonably inexpensive. I had, the top floor of this old brick row house that was owned by these three Italian sisters, and they each occupied the floors below, and then I had the top floor. Yeah.
Really?
And then it looked out on, there's a little park there. It was on Clinton Street. Yeah,
I actually looked at an apartment there once, owned by an Italian lady.
Oh, there's a lot of, it's an old Italian neighborhood, right?
I think it looked on a park, though. That's so wow.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah. And then a lot of the men used to be longshoremen down at the docks at Red Hook, and I guess they got some kind of deal when they, it was unionized, of course, and when they closed a lot of the docks, a lot of them got pretty good pensions or severance, and they would sit in these Italian men's clubs all day and drink espressos. And
sounds good to me.
It was nice. It was kind of like, I guess, Little Italy used to be in Manhattan.
Right.
It was more pure. Of course, now it's just getting super gentrified, I'm sure.
It is, and here also it just gets more expensive by the day.
Even
it's
Park
quite
Slope.
Frightening, really. Oh, Park Slope's terrible, yeah.
It's always, it's such a nice place, though. There's a lot of writers live there.
It's wonderful. I mean, it seems that every second neighbor is both a writer and a parent, so there's always
I was going to say, it's famous for the baby carriage traffic jams, right, on the sidewalks there.
Yeah. It's true. You can waste a lot of time on the street just chatting to people when you go out for coffee, so
that sounds
I like
nice.
that.
Yeah, I used to walk over there from Cobble Hill, I'd walk past Court Street and Smith Street, I think, and Hoyt Street, and then across the Gowanus Canal.
Oh, it's kind of sad, isn't it?
Yeah, has the Gowanus Canal ever become gentrified?
No, I'm sure
Parisian
it's on its way.
type cafes on the.
No, I think there's this one struggling bagel shop down there, and maybe it's going to be the first of many. I don't know, but that'll be the last thing to get pretty.
Yeah, I think they've wiped out the malaria though. A long time ago, and then from there to Park Slope.
Yeah. Did you to the park?
Yeah, I go to the park and the zoo and the botanical gardens, and sometimes to the Brooklyn Library. But mostly, when I lived in New York, I just like to walk around and look at the buildings and the people.
Yeah. So how does Santa Fe compare to Brooklyn?
It's nice. I miss Brooklyn and miss New York, but I really like living in Santa Fe. It's got some of the nice things about New York, in that. It's a pretty nice culture. There's a lot of writers here. We get good music and and I love the mountains and hiking.
Right, you can actually see beyond the next block.
That's
there,
nice.
I suppose.
And I like being able to see the stars at night.
Yeah.
Well, I've been reading your book, and I didn't quite get finished with it, but I'm really enjoying it.
Thank you.
This is great stuff.
So much.
And you're a linguist, right?
Yeah, I trained as a
linguist, and and it really shows, and yet it doesn't show in the fact that the book's really clearly written and just really fascinating. I've read so far the first section with the portraits of Noam Chomsky and Steven Pinker and Paul Lieberman, and then since I saw that I wasn't going to finish in time before I talked to you, I started just kind of reading reading through beyond that, and just wherever I would open up the book, it seems I would find some interesting thing that I didn't know.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's very kind of, I actually tell my friends they don't have to read the book at all. They just have to buy it. So it's very good of you to dip in at all.
Oh, no, it's great. And, the book starts out with this really, really interesting scene or device where you're imagining, the cloud of words above someone's head. And could you describe that a little?
Yeah. It might be a bit hard to, actually, because that preface that you're talking about, I think it's about 2.5 pages long, but that was the longest piece of writing, or that took the longest amount of time, that little part of the book. I think I really changed my own mind about language as I wrote that, and it was perhaps 2,000 words, and I think it took 4 or 5 weeks of bashing away at it every single day. So
it's just so well honed. I can imagine that it would take that long.
Thank you. Yeah. So the idea is just that to take all the knowledge that we have about language and just to sort of hang it above our heads instead of inside it, and just to visualize all the different words. There are about 60,000 words that most educated speakers of language have, and to imagine the connections between words as filaments, really, and sort of as you go through this process of imagining how a word like rose would be related to a word like nose. It sounds like it, so that information would be represented as a filament. How rose would be related to the word flower and to the word scent and fragrance. Then you very quickly build up this insanely complicated web of language.
And of course to the color red, and to all the people you know whose last name is Rose, or whose first name is Rose.
Exactly.
Rosie the Riveter, and a rose is a rose is a rose.
Indeed. Indeed.
So this dense web of shimmering connections.
Absolutely. And some of these connections would be a little thicker than others. Some of them would be very faint but still there. Some of them you would see just by proximity. And then once you imagine that for yourself, then imagine the person nearest you and imagine the web above their head, and then realize that every single node in that web that you've constructed has a corresponding node or a near corresponding node, because they speak language also. And then if you sort of step from 2 people to 5 people, and then your neighborhood, and then in fact all the speakers in the world, the complexity is absolutely mind-boggling.
Oh, that'd make a wonderful cartoon, like a New Yorker cover.
Well, that's a great idea, George. Perhaps someone should suggest that. I don't know.
Maybe they'll, and then it'll link to your book somehow.
That would be nice.
God, it's neat too, because like each individual is going to have a lot of the same broad strokes in these connections, but they'll be very different when you get down to the detailed level. Exactly.
No one person has exactly the same language as another person. There's always some kind of difference going along, whether it's at the sound or the level of sound, or whether it's a dialect thing or meaning. Of course, meaning is never discrete completely. There's always shades of meaning.
Yeah.
So
sure, and every word kind of shimmers with this haze of connotations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So that was both the kind of the starting point for me with the book, but also the end point as well. I really came back around to the idea of language as more like this web. And indeed, I sort of say, it is the web, and everyone is logged on. It's actually much more complicated than the web that we've built in the last 20 or 30 years, the Internet.
I love there was a quote from Terence Deacon, who said that language is more like a living organism than a mathematical proof.
Yes.
So it's elegant in the way that, like a butterfly is elegant, or a hummingbird, or a 3-toed sloth, but it's not elegant in the way that, say, Gödel's theorem is.
Exactly. And the model of language that people have been using for quite some time now is that it is, very much a theorem, that it's, Chomsky suggested that it was like, chemistry, that, language existed in the head in that discrete fashion, and that model only takes you so far. So I think when you think about language as an animal, and, the analogy extends out in some really nice ways, both in this idea of the beauty of language and the complete uniqueness of language. If language evolved again from the start, it wouldn't be exactly the same.
Yeah. in Chomsky, you start the book really with Chomsky, and that really is a nice. It's interesting because I don't, I'm not sure I'd ever really thought about it, or at least it hadn't struck me as hard as it did on reading the book. That how long the accepted dogma was that language. That it makes no sense to study how language evolved, right?
Right.
And of course Chomsky's big idea was that there's this, the deep structure. We have this wired-in kind of grammar, or it's more like a wired-in meta grammar, isn't it?
A wired-in what, sorry?
More of a meta, M-E-T-A grammar. It's not like English grammar's wired in, of course, or some specific grammar, but sort of a higher level grammar that you can use to generate one of these other specific grammars that actually exists on Earth.
Exactly. It is sort of the deepest level, or the level of most removed from which you can generate every other single grammar.
Yeah.
And
sort of like the kernel of an operating system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And that was a very revolutionary idea, and it also went along with this notion that language is innate. And along with that notion was this idea that somehow there was a specific part of your brain that was devoted to language and only to language, and also possibly that there was even a gene, a specific language gene. And so when you try to pack that amount of generative power into a single gene or a single part of the brain, then people couldn't even understand how it may have come about in our evolutionary history.
Yeah.
So they just stayed away from the question. It seemed impossible because of the way it was set up.
Right. Yeah, just and as because language leaves no fossils in the same way that bones do. So how would you study the evolution of language? And then also just the difficult idea of imagining how you have a little bit of language and I guess the main two reasons to believe in this idea of the universal deep structure was, one, that all languages, no matter how different they seem on the surface, seem to have the same structure. Mm-hmm. So, like, what was it? Chomsky said that if a Martian came to Earth, he would think that we were all speaking the same language.
Right. Right. That Martian metaphor, I tried to track that down throughout the course of the book, because Chomsky published a paper in 2002 along with two other researchers where that Martian metaphor was used again. And it's been used a number of times, and I don't understand how people get away with that metaphor in science. It's like saying if the exact person I want to walks into the room, has the exact interpretation, makes the interpretation I want them to make. It just doesn't make sense. How can people say, if a Martian comes along, they're going to think exactly what I want them to think?
Yeah.
It's going from zero to the exact interpretation you want someone to make.
So you're assuming that they would already have some kind of maybe meta deep structure that would allow them to even recognize what we call a language?
Well, certainly you're assuming that, but I think you're not even pausing to kind of deal with that stuff. You're just leaping straight to this notion that they would make, the kind of generalization you need them to make to then proceed with your argument.
Yeah.
I think you could use it any other way.
I mean, it's really just kind of a way to dramatize the idea that if you step way back and blur, so the details blur together, it's all really the same language that comes out of the Chomskyan deep structure. And that... And that figuring out how it would have evolved is either too hard or maybe it didn't evolve, that it was a byproduct of a spandrel.
Yes, that's right.
You had a good scene in there about Gould saying language is a spandrel. Could you remind me what that was?
Sure, yeah. Well, the spandrel idea was very much, or the spandrel word specifically, I guess, is very much Stephen Jay Gould and also, I believe, Richard Lewontin. And the idea is that I believe it's the arch is it a medieval church that the space when they create the arches was often used for painting and decoration, and that was called a spandrel. And if you walked into the church and looked at it, you might think people had set it up.
Yeah, to have this. So it's basically where, like, if you have an arch with a rectangle around it,
Right.
And it leaves these two spaces that are,
Right.
that are squared off on one side and curved on the other. So that's the spandrel?
Right,
Okay.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so the spandrel's just a byproduct of the fact that there's an arch set inside a building.
Yeah.
But you might assume that the spandrel was created for the purpose of placing art there in the first place.
Yeah,
So
right.
in biological terms, that we do have these spandrels. There are things, not everything about our bodies was specifically shaped or selected by nature. Some things have just come along for the ride.
Yeah, right.
I think, was it Pinker was talking about, was it wings started as heat exchangers? I should probably remember this.
Yeah, it's in your
right,
book.
And then they became wings.
and lungs started as
That's right.
as floating bladders.
Flotation bladders, yeah.
And then they're co-opted for some other use. And
Yes.
so the idea, I guess, would be with language that you'd have all these little modules in your brain that did various things, and once you reached a certain state of critical complexity,
That's
language would maybe just go, just emerge whole out of that.
Right, right. Although setting it up with little modules first, I think, is closer to the current version of language than the old version. I think the idea is more just that once you have this ability to generate these kind of computational patterns, or you can compute these patterns, you just have this great level of mental complexity, then somehow language is going to start to fall out of that.
So you start out with a skull full of neurons, and then you can make more and more connections, and at some point you get this density of connections, and language comes hovering out of it.
Right, right.
So it doesn't evolve at all, although obviously the brain evolved out of which.
Yes.
So that was kind of more or less what people were saying and then you described this turning point with Steven Pinker and Paul Bloom.
Right, right. So Paul Bloom, he's now a linguist at Yale, and he was a graduate student at the time, and he I think someone came and gave a talk at MIT where they were, and he remembers himself standing up saying, I think this person suggested that language did in fact evolve, or that natural selection played some kind of role in the evolution of language. And he remembers himself standing up saying, that's ridiculous, of course it didn't, and kind of producing the Stephen Jay Gould, Noam Chomsky line on it.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, he sort of had a much longer talk with the speaker and realized, actually, maybe this isn't right after all. So he went along to Pinker, and they put together a paper about it. It was published in 1990, and it was remarkable because there had been people working on the subject beforehand, and very important people whose work continues to matter a lot. But I think when Pinker, who was becoming quite well known at the time, although he still hadn't even published his first book, when he sort of came out and said, you know what, language evolution is a legitimate topic, and it's not just legitimate, it's probably going to be a fruitful one as well, then a lot of people paid attention. And a lot of people who had been very interested in the idea but had felt constrained by this kind of silence about the subject then felt freed to look into it a lot more.
Yeah. And I guess one of the things that persuaded them that you could study language is that, there's the old argument against the eye that the creationists love to use, that it couldn't possibly have evolved because, it's so complex and you need this piece to have that piece. And, of course, that's been shown to really be a fallacy, and you can have this incremental evolution along with spandrels where something evolves for another purpose and then is incorporated. So that's kind of what Pinker and Bloom then were saying about language.
That was one of their points about it.
That we can think of it as something that incrementally...
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Exactly. So again, this old idea was more that language was this entirely discrete entity and it just kind of appeared out of nowhere. But then if you accept the notion that it might have evolved in bits and pieces, then you start to see how it could have happened over quite a long amount of time, and that perhaps some aspects of language are spandrels and maybe some aspects are adaptations, but you can't even... You start asking those questions until you start setting up what the actual trajectory of language in time was.
Yeah. And Pinker, like Chomsky, came out of MIT, right? So
that's right.
That, I guess, gave it some added credibility since he was coming from the school of Chomsky, and
Very much so, very
Yeah.
much so. And I think people still nowadays think of him as very much a Chomskyan, and there are ways in which he really does sort of agree with the Chomskyan viewpoint, but he's
they're
quite
not
different
mutually
as well,
exclusive.
really.
Yeah. Well, you just reviewed his new book.
Right. Let me show that, because I would like to show you just how incredibly thick this book is. It's a bit thicker than the usual book you would review, don't you think?
This is the stuff of thought, huh?
This is the stuff of
Yeah,
thought, and there is
I'm
a
up
lot
to-
of stuff of
I'm
thought.
up to about page 100.
Are you really? How are you finding it?
A lot of stuff in there.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah,
There is.
It's brilliant, but
Yeah.
brilliant stuff. But
Yeah.
wow, it's very, very detailed, and
It is.
it's like she's trying to expose the scaffolding of language by doing these really microscopic looks at how we use different words.
Yeah.
And could you describe one of those?
Yeah. Well, so the idea, as I sort of recall him describing it, is just using language as a peephole onto the brain, and showing that the way language is set up is actually is reflective of these sort of default ways we have of thinking about the world. I'm not sure I could even redo one of the ones that I discussed in the review.
Yeah, well, I probably read the review since you have, and so I remember one of them.
Oh, please tell me what I wrote.
Because I just read it yesterday.
Okay, great.
It had to do with you can say I'll load a wagon with
Right.
hay, and you can say I'll toss hay into the wagon, and those seem to mean the same things at first blush. But then you can say I'm going to load the wagon, period. But you can't say I'm going to toss the wagon.
I'm not sure that's. I think it's.
Maybe that's from the book and not from your.
Yeah,
review.
no,
but
that is right.
like
But
that.
you're missing a phrase there. There's one. It's like I'm gonna load the wagon with hay. No. Okay, I'm gonna load hay into the wagon.
Yeah.
I'm gonna toss hay into the wagon.
Right.
And you can say I'm gonna load the wagan with hay, but you can't say I'm gonna
Toss the wagon with hay.
hay.
That's it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I short-circuited over.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I understand how that works. So there's a reason why the first two work, but you can only say load the wagon with hay and not toss the wagon with hay. And without going into too much detail, the constructions, rest upon these really complicated ideas. Like Pinker takes that anomaly basically and shows how these really simple sentences sort of show how sort of mentally we're committed to these ideas of space and motion. The laws of physics basically, but physics as sort of warped by the human mind.
Yeah.
And
warped.
As shaped by the human mind.
It's kind of warped physics. I like that.
Yeah, well, I was sort of thinking that, there's that idea of the anthropic principle, this notion that, this sounds like I'm going way off field, but believe me, I'll bring it back.
That's actually traditional for Science Saturday.
Oh, well, this idea that sort of the universe is shaped to suit us. But, what Pinker shows is that as far as our brains are concerned and as far as the ways we interpret, the sort of the natural ways we interpret space and time and motion as reflected in language, this really is anthropic. We carve time up as it suits us, or as we as humans see it, and that's reflected in language. And similarly with these grammatical constructions that seem so small scale in one way, is that actually that stuff is shot all through language, and it really shows. It shows things about, in this case, it was space, I believe. But I can't tell you exactly why right now.
Yeah, but just the general idea is what's important. This notion that you can use this to try to lay bare this kind of folk physics that's embedded in the brain. But then there's just this huge accumulation of these examples, and he just kind of relishes each one like a little jewel.
He does.
It's really quite nice.
And I think maybe part of the reason why he's devoted such intense attention to these in such detail is that no one's really done this before with the meaning, with all this incredible work about meaning that he explores. There hasn't been a book like this, and there really should have been, but again, it's part of that tradition wherein the sort of the syntax, the structure and the grammar of language are seen as much more important.
Yeah.
So Pinker's really doing a very important job just bringing this stuff to the world, let alone putting it together the way he does.
Yeah, yeah. It's probably good that it was, it waited until he wrote the book.
Sorry, what? Rather than have someone else do it?
Yeah. It's just, he's so good at it. Well, unless it had been you. But,
thank you.
Right.
Yes. Next time.
No, another thing that really struck me in Pinker's book, and maybe this was also in your book, with this idea that, the difference between regular and irregular verbs, and how that we just have this algorithm really for regular verbs. So, like as soon as the word blog was invented as a portmanteau of web blog, then we very quickly know that the past tense has to be blogged, and yet we have these exceptions. So we have, on one hand, we have this algorithm that can generate past tenses in all these different cases, but then we have these irregular ones, and each one has to be memorized.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
And I actually I looked at a paper. I mentioned some work in my book which seems to suggest, for the first time, that some scientists have been able to see almost the circuit of processing of those different words in the brain, showing that perhaps the irregular verbs actually, I guess, the activation traveled along a different circuit and seemed to be processed in the way, say, a word just like a noun is, or a word that doesn't have any internal syntax. They just seem to exist there as single words. But the regular verbs were quite different. Pinker has gotten so much out of regular and irregular verbs. They're really his thing, and he seems to bring them up in every book and get something new out of them every time.
Another little window.
Yes, yeah.
And then there's that suggestion. Was that with Philip Lieberman in your book, where that sort of thing, this these little generative algorithms like that for language might be related to the motor area of the brain and sequencing, and it's just fascinating. Yeah,
that's Phil Lieberman's idea. I think that's really interesting. It seems to be sort of his main thing rather than others, but he's taken that idea and sort of done all this incredible research. For example, he looks at people who are climbing up Mount Everest, and he compares them to various populations, like, for example, people who have Parkinson's disease, and there seems to be something similar going on in the brain of both groups. So for Parkinson's disease, it's this progressive disease that affects the motor system and various other abilities.
Oh, yeah. So what is it? How does it affect their language use, if you have?
Well, their syntax, their motor system, if I'm remembering correctly, their syntax seems to go first, and there are things that they can't do. They can, for example, understand perhaps active and passive sentences like the hawk ate the mouse, or the mouse was eaten by the hawk, but then they can't produce them. I'm messing this up a bit.
Oh,
but
no,
that's the basic idea.
I remember now. Yeah.
Yeah, and so mountain climbers.
So they lose that infinite recursive ability, right? Where you can say the cat, on the hat and the.
Right. That's definitely where it goes in the end. That's definitely where it goes in the end, and it starts off.
Round and around.
With that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But mountain climbers, because they suffer oxygen deprivation, actually suffer a similar kind of problem. And so Lieberman has done this amazing work where, he sets up a base camp on Everest and monitors these guys as they're going up the mountain, and they check in at various intervals, and just through this sort of audio connection, he can actually begin to work out what's going on in their brains as they start to be poorer with their grammar as they go up, and potentially make a little less sense. And even the specific sounds of words they make actually shows that there's stuff going on in their brains. And this not only gives us an insight into what might have happened sort of evolutionary in evolutionary terms, because it sort of shows us, well, you have to have this motor system in order to produce this syntax, and that when one is affected, the other might be affected as well. So there's a kind of a piggybacking that syntax does. But also astronauts on their way to Mars. NASA actually funded, or do you say NASA, right? Sorry, NASA.
I say NASA, but I'm
NASA.
from Arkansas.
Yeah. NASA funded some of his research because they want to work out how they can monitor the health of astronauts who might be on their way to Mars.
That's wow. And they were losing, as they got higher and higher on Everest. Well, base camp's 18,000 feet, so then they go up 11,000 feet from that. And as they got higher, they would kind of lose their sequencing abilities, right?
Exactly.
Both with language and with, well, there was a very tragic story that you told.
It's remarkable that people actually put themselves in that situation, given that it seems the sort of the brain damage, the kind of temporary brain damage they suffer is actually crucial for their survival. So as climbers go up Everest, they have to, go through this series of sequencing of clipping and unclipping of safety harnesses. And one climber that the researchers became very worried about because his speech seemed to degrade really fast. They actually asked him to come down because they thought he was in danger, and he actually died, I think about a day later, and they discovered later that it looked like he hadn't gone through the proper sequencing of clipping in order to make himself safe. There was nothing actually wrong with his equipment at all.
And he fell to his death?
Yeah. But I remember you wrote an article about climbers who were physicists. Right?
Oh, yeah, that was a few years ago. Yeah,
I remember talking to you about that.
That's right.
Yeah.
I refer. Yeah, a lot of theoretical physicists are serious mountain climbers and serious rock climbers.
Yeah. And so Lieberman's work shows that they're putting themselves through this temporary brain damage every single time. I don't know how that's affecting their theories at all.
Yeah, and then and you hope it's temporary. I would think it would depend on how long you had the deprivation. And
I'm sure that's true too. But you wrote another fantastic article just recently. Was it last week? The Week in Review. It was about Watson.
Out of the whole James Watson thing. That was basically. By the time I got to it, it had been thoroughly covered by the Times, and they asked me to try to spin off an essay about how the scientific community deals with someone like, some great scientist like Watson who says something that seems over the top and causes great outrage. And the piece ended up going in different directions, and I just kind of made it more into sort of an essay about, crazy things that Nobel laureates have said. And
of which there's such a rich supply, right?
There's a rich supply, there is. And I'm glad you liked that. It was kind of hard to write because I didn't, want to repeat a lot of stuff that was already in the paper. And, But
what do you think of what's happened to James Watson now? What's your sense of...
I mean, I was really kind of troubled by it. After that story appeared, I must have gotten a dozen emails from people, mostly very negative, saying, they ranged, and one of them, the general theme of all of these emails was that I was being terribly PC, as in politically correct, to criticize James Watson for saying or seeming to say anyway, that there was a scientific basis for believing that black Africans are inherently less intelligent than white people. And it is what he was quoted as saying, and he didn't deny he said it, and then later he said, well, I can't believe I really could have said something because there actually isn't any scientific basis. But what these people in their emails were saying was, well, of course there's scientific basis, and you're, really? Suppressing it as part of the, and then...
Were these just readers, or were these other researchers?
Well, they were readers, but they were some of them were obviously very, very smart people who had read a lot of... But it all came down to the old thing where they're saying, well, certainly it's true that test scores, show lower IQs, but then that opens up the whole question of to what degree tests, these IQ tests, actually measure something called intelligence, and whether there really is... a general intelligence, or, G is what Arthur Jensen called it in his papers, where he tried to show, and still claims, that IQ tests do indeed test some inherent thing called G, or general intelligence, that has to do with abstract thinking.
Yeah.
And, to those people who follow Jensen, if you're saying that, well, we don't really know what the tests test, and there's actually, like Howard Gardner at Harvard says there's, all different kinds of intelligence.
Multiple
intelligences.
Right, yeah.
And that comes off to Jensen's followers as just special pleading. So these are the people I was hearing from, and some of them were really quite nasty about it.
Yeah, I'm surprised to hear that there was that kind of response. I mean, it just seems so obviously not okay to say something like that, and so clearly wrong.
Well, it made me wish I'd done the article very differently. A better essay in retrospect would have been to use this to actually examine what research has been done. And the most interesting thing I could find was a study that had been done by Ulrich Neisser, the psychologist in a group of people, and it was after that book, The Bell Curve, came out a few years ago. And they basically concluded that, we just don't know the extent to which intelligence is genetically determined and the extent to which it's environmentally determined. Obviously, it's a bit of both, but we still have such crude tools we can't really say. And, and within this uncertainty, for someone to make as extreme a remark as Watson said was, really, at the very least, impolitic.
Oh, yeah. It's really, so clearly, I'm so shocked to hear that people actually objected to the response to what happened. There was a fantastic paper recently by a group working out of Leipzig, and Mike Tomasello was one of the main researchers, and I spoke to him and sort of looked at his work a lot for my book. But this paper came after the book was published, and it speaks directly to that idea of general intelligence, whether there is this thing called general intelligence. So the experiment was remarkable. It was the first of its kind. They took a group of human infants and they tested them against two groups of other great apes, orangutans and chimpanzees. And there was I think the chimpanzees there was 100 or more of them, and there were, I believe, many orangutans, although not as many as chimpanzees. And they tested them on various measures of social intelligence and spatial intelligence, and I think there was some other measure as well. And the basic finding was that human infants and chimpanzees and orangutans, human infants and chimpanzees performed about the same on the spatial intelligence and whatever the other measure was, but not on social intelligence. That was the only arena in which humans surpassed. So
that's interesting.
The other great apes. It was fantastic, and it says so many fascinating things, but I think it explodes this idea of the general intelligence.
Yeah.
I mean, even between species, you can start to break it down and compare and see, with our close brothers and sisters in evolutionary terms, the ways in which they're thinking is actually the same as ours.
Wow, that's really interesting. We should send them a link later to put up on the website.
Definitely.
If you have a link to that paper.
Yeah, I wrote a little piece about it for Huffington Post, actually.
Oh,
so
great.
We'll
link to that.
Yeah.
I don't know what I think about whether there's something called general intelligence. I guess I believe that there is something that, that I think of intelligence as your ability to form mental maps about your world.
Right.
Or that's thinking. I would define thinking as the ability to form mental maps about describing your world that help you navigate through it, and intelligence to be a measure of how well you make the maps. And for some cultures, I guess the question is like sub-Saharan African culture always comes out, way low on Western IQ tests, and even when they make what they think are efforts to remove as much cultural bias as possible, but you're still measuring people on their ability to represent things like in these little, precise pictures and manipulate, pictures and paper and you can see how something like that, could just be cultural.
I think the weight of culture. I mean, and
just the idea of a test. You sit in this room now, and then we put you these pieces of paper with these marks on them, and then
the very fact of testing. And I mean, just to go back to animals again for a second. I looked at a lot of animal research for my book, and the same holds true for animals. I mean, animal testing for cognition. For years has involved applying these kind of human situations that animals don't perform well in them. So, for example, I remember Franz de Waal telling me, he's a researcher at Emory, and he has this incredible office where he sits up on top of a compound of chimpanzees, and one of the walls of his office is glass, and he looks down upon them. And he was just saying in basic imitation experiments, people thought that various other apes couldn't imitate very well for a long time until they hit upon the idea of getting apes to imitate other apes instead of imitate humans. And just that very simple shift has made this huge difference in what we now know about the abilities of other animals.
Yeah. Going back to Watson, something you'd asked me in an email that that I've been thinking about. Obviously Watson has been making some pretty over-the-top, outrageous comments ever since he wrote The Double Helix.
And what has he said? I mean, I don't know specifically what he said, but I know it's his reputation to make really controversial.
Oh yeah,
and not just controversial, but just
really likes
perhaps
to rile
off-color
people.
or inappropriate statements.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So what else has he said? Do you recall?
Oh well, there was a talk that he'd given a couple of years ago where he was saying, what was it? He was suggesting that there may be some kind of biological linkage between the genes that produce, is it melanin for skin color, and your sexual, your sex drive. And he was, really? I think his line was that you don't hear people talking about great, I don't know if it was Norwegian lovers or English lovers or something like this, just the Latin lovers, and it's the kind of thing he'll say, and knowing that some people are going to find that offensive, and
that's so nice. Do you think he said that only to provoke? I mean,
well, both.
He actually thought there was any.
I think most of it's I don't think Watson is racist. I think he's. Driven by the ability. I mean, driven by this almost compulsion to violate taboos and to challenge people's ingrained thinking, and it's just that this time he went maybe a little further, and then in a context where it just really resonated. The fact that he was actually being interviewed by a former student and someone who had lived in his house, his family's house there.
Really?
Doing some kind of internship, I forget. But it was interesting to go back and actually read the original article that was I think it was in the Independent, where Watson was quoted as saying this, and it's a nice piece, and the fact that she knew Watson, and it gave the article some more credibility maybe, and made it harder for him to say he didn't really say that, and then two, he was probably feeling very comfortable and maybe forgetting that the meter was running while he was talking.
I guess so. I always wonder about situations like this too. Why now? I mean, as you say, he's made comments like this for a long time. How is it that suddenly the trigger, there was this series of reactions that have culminated in, this very serious end to his career.
And was it just the straw that broke the camel's back, and just the, just like it lit a fire in the British media, and then came to the United States, and the cancellation of the talk at the British Science Museum.
That's right. And
so, but you imagine that this sort of thing has been rumbling beneath the surface for a long time, and and Cold Spring Harbor was thinking, well, it's really not helpful to have this guy, be the single most famous person whose name is associated with the lab. And I mean, in some ways, it's wonderful since he was such an important scientist. And also, someone reminded me that that actually during the early part of the 20th century, Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory was a real focus for the human eugenics movement and eugenics research. Yeah.
Who was doing that kind of work?
Yeah.
Do you know who it was?
Oh, who it was? No,
Yeah.
I'd have to go back and look, but see what happens if I Google
disturbing.
Cold Spring Harbor genetics. But the last thing they want is someone to, those are different times, and as far as.
Sure.
It was the home of the eugenics record office.
The record office.
Yeah.
So what, experiments or what, other stuff was done elsewhere and recorded there, or do you know how that worked?
Yeah, I'm not sure here. Let me. History. The laboratory began in 1890 as an extension of the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences. Well, that's interesting.
It is.
Let's see.
Brooklyn connection.
Yeah. Not far from Brooklyn, I guess. Okay, during the years 1910 to 1940, Cold Spring Harbor was the home of the Eugenics Record Office. Oh, Charles Davenport and Harry H. Laughlin, two prominent American eugenicists of the period. In 1935, the Carnegie Institution sent a team to review their work, and as a result, the ERO was ordered to stop all efforts. So in 1939, the Institute withdrew funding for the Eugenics Record Office entirely.
Oh my gosh.
And the reports, articles, charts, and pedigrees were considered scientific facts in their day, but have since been discredited. That would be interesting to know more of that history.
Yeah. Have you heard of those guys before?
I've heard of Davenport.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not something I've looked into a lot. Probably the last time was when I read, Stephen Jay Gould's book,
The Mismeasure of Man.
Yeah. So,
no, that is interesting. I've been meaning to go visit Cold Spring Harbor.
Yeah, I've never actually, I've been by there, and for some reason I've never, went on the grounds. I think maybe I went on the grounds and walked around, but I never, used my credentials to try to get a tour.
Right. I'm sure you could get in if you wanted to.
Yeah, I'm sure I could. I just never got around to it.
So there was another guy that you mentioned in that piece, whose name escapes me right now. The
Nobelists who.
What was his name?
You mean the piece on the Nobel over-the-top Nobel statements? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Deutsche? Is it Deutsche?
David Deutsch.
Yeah, Deutsch.
Yeah, he's a quantum physicist and quantum computing theorist at
multiple
Oxford.
worlds, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think of the fact that you mentioned that? Made me think that you didn't think much of the multiple worlds.
Oh, well,
idea.
I find it fascinating. In a way, I was just kind of trying to poke a little, because the situation was that the Royal Mail, which is like the British Postal Service, had issued these commemorative stamps honoring Nobel Prize winners, and in one of the pamphlets, they were talking about it was a pamphlet that came with the stamps for collectors, I guess, and one of the pamphlets made the comment that about how important quantum mechanics was, and that it may lead to solve other big mysteries like mental telepathy. And so this came out in this official pamphlet, and all these British physicists just, couldn't believe it. And then it turned out that this had all come from, what's his name? God, I'm drawing a blank. I'll have to look up. See, we were talking before about how we forget our own stories and what we write.
It's really sad. The writing and the talking are very different activities.
They're very different. There's another good. Okay, wait. I'm going to find this so I don't drag myself
I have
crazy.
your article here, too.
Oh, okay.
Where did it go?
Yeah, it would be about... the article's called Bright Scientists' Dim Notions.
Fred Hoyle.
No, it was after Fred Hoyle. Yeah, Fred Hoyle was there for another reason.
No, that's right. He's the creationist.
It was moving
Brian
Josephson. Brian
Yeah,
Josephson did this important solid-state research involving superconductivity and got a Nobel Prize. And there's something called the Josephson junction. So when they found out that he was the one who had acted as a consultant for the Royal Mail, and that's where that that came from. And
right.
My favorite part was the spokesman for the Royal Mail said, Nature, the journal Nature was interviewing her about this, and she says, oh, perhaps we should have checked that. But if he has a Nobel Prize for his work, that should give him some credibility.
You know, I'm with her. That's fair.
Yeah. Well, and then David Deutsch later said on the Observer, he was among the physicists who was just appalled that they were, talking about mental telepathy of all things, and then even worse, relating it to quantum mechanics. So he said that Josephson's speculations were, quote, utter rubbish, unquote. And then I just couldn't resist adding the line that Dr. Deutsch is known for proposing the existence of a multiplicity of parallel universes.
Right, yes.
But I didn't necessarily mean that was on the same level. I mean, John Horgan would say that,
Sure.
I'm sure. But
it's out there. I mean, it's definitely
out there. And it's a respectable theory.
Idea.
And actually in the next sentence I said, but of course there's a difference between bold speculations and Dr. Watson's reckless remarks. So
yes.
But,
indeed, they are.
At least one person took that wrong.
Well, speaking of reckless remarks, am I misremembering this, or is David Deutsch also a proponent? There's some British physicist who thinks that raising children should be done in this kind of free-range, evolutionary kind of way, where infants should actually, in a sense, make their own minds up about what to eat and what not to eat and what's safe.
Really?
And
free-range children.
Yeah, maybe it's and really alarmingly free-range children too.
Yeah.
Just the idea that sort of pedagogy, that parental guidance, is actually kind of holding children back from this idea of some kind of innate wisdom which would guide them otherwise without us to get in their way. Have you heard of that before?
I'm looking at his webpage right now. That would be really interesting if that was.
Yeah.
I mean,
well,
if so, then I really missed a great opportunity to write another sentence there. After.
Yes. Yeah, because more than multiple worlds, that is about the craziest idea I think I've ever heard.
Yeah, although it has a decent intellectual pedigree, though. I mean, there's as far as understanding quantum mechanics, it's almost mainstream to believe that. You may not believe that the multiple universes are real, but to think in terms of the many worlds or many universes idea. So where if you measure an experiment and the electron randomly comes out spinning this way instead of that way, that it's not really random because actually the universe splits in two. But you talk to people like Murray Gell-Mann about that, and he has what he calls many histories, and it's subtly different, and he's not really saying that these are ontologically real, these other universes. I think that's how to read them. And then, but then Deutsch really thinks they're real, and that we should be able to actually maybe find subtle effects that they have in our universe, and more strikingly that the idea of a quantum computer is you use this idea in quantum mechanics where every possible state that the particle can be in actually exists at once in this superposition, and so many universes or many worlds would say that each one of those superpositions actually works, it actually exists in a different universe. And then Deutsch is saying, so if we have a quantum computer that harnesses this to simultaneously solve all of these different parts of a problem that are in quantum superposition, that the computation is actually taking part in all these different universes, that they're really there, and just the fact of a quantum computer would prove that these other universes exist.
I'm sorry, how would it prove that these other universes
exist? That's what I don't. That's where I don't follow them to the next step. I mean, I think it's a way of thinking about it, about what's going on in a quantum computer and how all these things can be happening at once. And you can think about them as happening in these different universes, but there's other ways you can think about it as well. So, and his argument's much more sophisticated and detailed than that, and he wrote a really interesting book about it. But I mean, I guess the point I was trying to make was, physics has gotten so close to the crumbling edge of what it's possible to know, and just the that you can sort of imagine some poor editor at the British mail service thinking, well, we hear all this other weird stuff all the time about.
Exactly. You know what?
So why not mental telepathy? And
I think it's entirely fair, and I mean, I think it's sort of fair on that front, and I think also I'm just thinking of television and the representation of science on television, and I'm sure on any one night you can find a documentary that purports to investigate telepathy, and I mean, people sort of seem to be able to haul up researchers out of nowhere to speak, with supposed expertise on any subject these days. So I'm sure for the general public it can be a bit baffling sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, the universe is very strange,
Yeah.
and quantum mechanics shows us that that's true. And
Yeah. Are you working on another book now? Is that physics too?
oh, well, actually, I just finished. It actually just came out. The book didn't come out, but it's out in Bound to Galleys.
Oh, okay.
You remember that exciting moment, right?
I do. You'll have to send me a copy.
Oh, I will.
Yeah.
I'll hold. I mean, it's just it just has the white and black cover. It's called The 10 Most Beautiful Experiments. And
wow.
Actually, I'll hold up. There's a bad reproduction of what the real cover will look like. And it's actually not coming out until next April or May, I think. But so we're way ahead of schedule, which is nice. And
that's amazing. How do you get ahead of schedule? I was so constantly behind all.
I say it's ahead of schedule, but I delivered the manuscript, either 2 or 3 years late. I can't even.
Oh, really?
Remember.
That makes me feel better.
Oh, well, yeah.
It
doesn't. That's the nice thing about writing about science, that you're not usually writing on the cutting edge, like with a political book, anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, you kind of are in science, but it's not the same thing. So, I've. People ask, they say, oh, well, I tell them I'm like 2 years behind on this book, and they say, oh, God, what's your editor say about this? And my experience usually is, you'll call them up and they'll just sort of vaguely remember that you're supposed to be writing something about science.
I think that's true. I was counseling a friend just the other day that, I think they're delighted to see a book at all, that they don't necessarily expect it to be on time, let alone, in some cases, to arrive. So
it's just so hard to know when to stop, too. Robert Wright and I were talking about this I think it was last week, and there's a famous line that a book's never actually finished, it's just abandoned.
Oh gosh, I feel that's so true of my book. I mean, there's stuff I would include now if I had a chance.
So
it's nothing that changes the line of the book, which I think is probably the most important thing. But there continue to be wonderful experiments that I would just love to throw in, or even just a line here or a sentence there.
Yeah.
Do you feel that way about your?
Oh yeah, and the worst thing is I try not to read them after they come out.
Oh, I'm sure. I can't. I couldn't read
or I
mine
hold
at
it
all.
kind of at arm's length. I'm afraid I'll see something and go, ah.
Yes, it's kind of off-putting, isn't it? It's really frightening to even crack the covers at all.
It's funny too. After you write a book, even if it's years have passed, you'll be talking to someone, like a relative or an in-law or a friend or just someone you meet at a party, and maybe they've just read your book, which is nice, and then they'll say something like, there's something you said, on page 242 about, information, and it's like they have the idea, or the instinct that you have the whole book in your head there still, and of course, actually, it's more like, crocheting or needlepoint, where you just kind of work through it from the beginning to the end, and then you pick up. I think John and I talked about this once. You pick up the index to your own book and look at it, and you go, wait, what did I say about that?
Absolutely. I think crocheting is a great analogy, actually, because it's just like you do a step at a time, and then the bit that's behind you, it's kind of behind you. Yeah.
And the whole thing, it looks like, you get the illusion when you read a book, it projects this illusion of, the author having this great, not only having this great erudition, but having, immediate recall of all this erudition and access. And, of course, actually, you're sitting there and go, God, what was that again? And then Googling it or looking through a stack of papers. And
it's...
and then you eventually spin this web.
Great. So I'm delighted to hear that the next couple of books are going to be exactly the same. I'm not going to end up remembering any of my books.
Oh,
is
no.
That right?
Yeah, it's always a big surprise.
But if you're at the galley stage, then you must still be at that great stage where you have the capacity to keep rereading what you've written in order to fix it. Is that right?
Well, I'm at the point now where first they sent me, they do two galley passes at Knopf, and they sent me the first one where I could basically have my way with it.
Good. Was that after your editor had edited it?
After editing, yeah. So
Okay.
it was after. So I got the copy edited manuscript back first, and of course made all kinds of changes, and then I got the galleys, just printed pages, but they hadn't been paginated necessarily. I mean, they were paginated, but it wasn't locked in yet, so I could add and subtract lines or paragraphs or even pages. And now I've gotten to the point where it's locked in, so I can make changes, but I can't do anything unless absolutely necessary that would add or subtract a line.
That's painful, that stage,
Yeah, that's
isn't it?
when it's more like chiseling, in granite.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't seem to be a sort of language activity at all, almost, because you're physically having to place things.
It really is painful.
Things. Yeah. But you almost done. You must be almost done.
I'm almost done, and I only know. I was working on something after the bound galleys went to the printer, and I found one error in my chapter on the Lavoisier that I have to fix, and of course, I worry that this is what'll go out to all the reviewers in advance to read, and of course they'll all immediately pounce on my error about Lavoisier.
Of course. George Johnson, what does he know about... Yeah.
You fool!
Yes, exactly.
It renders the entire book
I remember
nonsense.
that stage very well. So, well, at the risk of asking you a question that you can't answer, what defines beauty in an experiment? What makes an experiment beautiful?
Well, that was part of the trick of the book, is you have to set it up in such a way that you can make a case for why you're picking 10 experiments when you could pick 100. I thought of it as a case where a scientist, preferably one scientist, maybe two, in most cases one, figured out a very elegant way to propose a question to nature, or a very crisp way to ask a question of nature and then receive a crisp, unambiguous reply.
Okay.
I think that's how I described it in the preface. And then as an added attraction, it's nice if the apparatus itself had a certain elegance. And so altogether, it's kind of beauty in the classical sense, like the lines of a Greek statue, the economy of the explanation, and the yeah.
And then why was it 10? Did you?
Oh, well, you can't write a book called The 9 Most Beautiful Experiments.
37?
Yeah, the 37 Most Beautiful Experiments.
Was it hard to choose?
It was, yeah. And I, part of the fun is you're throwing down the gauntlet and saying, these are the 10 most beautiful experiments, and everyone who reads it, who's interested in these things, will have another list, and they'll say, well, the reviewers will say, why would you include this experiment and not that experiment? So it'll be great fun, and I actually have an epilogue that I'm still tinkering with called The 11th Most Beautiful Experiment.
The one you just couldn't leave out?
Yeah, or just thinking about what I should have put in maybe, and why I didn't. It was a lot of fun. It's a very short book, but in some ways it's one of the hardest ones I ever wrote, because every chapter with the research, you're like starting from scratch.
Really?
Yeah, because it's like the first one is on Galileo's experiment with the inclined plane, and so you're steeping yourself in Galileo studies while you're writing this chapter, and
there must be a lot to read too about Galileo.
Oh, yeah, that's true, and in some ways Galileo was the easiest because there's not much in the way of original material. And when you get to somebody like Lavoisier, who sort of discovered oxygen, the nature of chemical combustion, there's a lot more material, but they're completely different worlds of information. So, it's not like what I was writing when I wrote a book about quantum computing, as you write and research, you're accumulating this knowledge that you use throughout the book.
Yeah.
And in this, I was starting from scratch with each chapter.
Yeah, that would be really hard.
Yeah.
That would be very hard. I find with stuff like that too, you have to read so much in order to work out what you don't need to read.
Yeah. Oh,
as
yeah.
well. The ability to, when you're in a place where you can actually start to discard and ignore stuff, you're actually really...
Yeah, you get to the point where you know the
along,
contours of the field,
yeah.
and you start seeing the same people cited again and again.
Exactly. But getting to that place
close.
takes a very long time.
Oh, it does. How long did you work on your book?
5 years.
5 years, yeah.
5 years. So it was definitely longer than I told my editor it would be, and it was certainly longer than I thought it was going to be. And I'm really hoping to spend less time on the next book.
Oh, it was,
but I don't know.
5 years is that's what it takes sometimes. And,
yeah. And the book felt like it needed 5 years, sort of looking back in the end, but maybe if
it was worth it. It was worth the 5 years, and it's been very well received, and of course we'll link to it. This is a year. I guess we should wind up here in a few minutes. A year of good language books, right? Because there was Pinker's that you just reviewed, The World of Thought, and then there was this book by Margaret Fox.
That's right. I haven't read that yet.
Yeah.
But very interesting. Definitely on the to-read pile.
Yeah. I just read the review, and I guess she went to this village in Israel, and she's also a trained linguist. And
that's right.
And went to this village in Israel where there was genetic deafness, and as a result they had developed their own sign language. Right.
And it's actually that experiment, that research is fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to reading her book. But that particular group is often held up as a kind of example for language evolution, and I think that's really wrong-headed because, of course, what these deaf individuals came up with, what they evolved in terms of their communication, they were communicating with people who had language all along, even if they couldn't hear them.
So they were already in a linguistic context.
Basically, yeah.
They saw people exchange, making funny lip movements and communicating and
just being in the world in a
particular way. They were in the world and in a culture.
Yeah.
Oh, this brings us to a perfect point where we can talk about the last section of your book, where you imagine this thought experiment.
Right.
Where a shipload of babies is shipwrecked. Poor babies are shipwrecked on the Galapagos Islands.
That's right.
And then you're pondering and asking your the people in your book now to ponder whether the babies would develop a language.
Right. That was a really fun little experiment
for
me to do. But, because as a writer, I'm sure the same is true for you, all the way along you see experiments you'd like to actually conduct yourself, but you don't have a chance to. So this was a little thought experiment for me. So I asked whether these children would evolve language at all without any language input. And part of the goal of it was to highlight the fact that even though there is a increasing consensus in this really wonderful new field of language evolution, there's obviously still a lot of individual differences between the scholars. So Phil Lieberman, who we mentioned earlier, his was the shortest response, and it was just simply no. He doesn't think there's any innateness at all. But others seemed to converge upon this idea that maybe if you had a critical mass, like someone described it as a village-sized amount of children, so maybe about 30 individuals, then over a couple of generations you would get perhaps, a Creole and then eventually full language in not too many generations at all. So, and some others, or at least one other researcher thought all you needed was 2 individuals to talk back and forth.
Wow, just 2 people.
Yeah.
Not did anyone say, well, yes, they develop language, but it would take 10,000 years, and they have to develop a culture as well. Yeah.
Because that's actually how it did happen, and I mean, I guess the idea too, there's really important difference to consider is the fact that the human species, we're now language ready. We do have these brains now that have clearly shown to be able to produce language, but throughout evolution it was just this very incremental process as far as brain power, went as well. So I think now that we've proven to be able to do it, most of them thought it would only take a short amount of time.
Huh. Well, it was a great way to end the book.
Thank you. It was really fun to do. I really enjoyed that.
Great way to end our conversation, I guess.
Great to
talk
speak
for
to you,
another
George.
hour easily, but
yeah, maybe another time.
Another time for sure.
Okay, great.
Okay, it's good
All
talking
right.
to you, Chris.
Take care.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.